The sun was just setting over the dusty Californian horizon, casting long shadows across the dry plains where peace once lived. Clint Eastwood, grizzled, silent, and weary-eyed, stood on his porch, watching the golden light bathe the family home he built with his own hands. Inside, laughter echoed. His daughter was setting the table, his wife humming a tune from the radio. For a moment, time stood still. This was the kind of silence Clint's character, Frank Delaney, had fought wars for, both overseas and on the streets. But silence can be a liar. That night, the cartel came like phantoms. No warning, no mercy. The explosion ripped through the house with the fury of a god's wrath. When Clint came to, bloodied and bruised in the dirt, all he could hear was the wind whistling through the broken bones of his life. His family was gone. His past resurrected. And as the ambulance lights painted his world red and blue, Clint's eyes weren't filled with tears. They were filled with something far more dangerous. Clarity. A week later, at dawn, he walked to the old barn behind the burned remains of his home. Beneath a dusty tarp, untouched for years, slept a machine forged in the fires of rebellion. His black '68 Mustang fastback, engine like a growl from hell. He peeled back the cover, ran his hand over the hood, and muttered with grit in his throat, "Time to finish what they started." The hunt was on. It wasn't just rage fueling Frank Delaney now. It was purpose, sharpened to a blade. A man who had once laid his weapons to rest was now crafting a warpath, step by brutal step. Clint Eastwood's eyes, cold and calculating, scanned a wall in his garage where faded photographs, old service medals, and worn-out maps still hung. But today, something new joined them. A list. A blood-red marker drew a line down the middle of an old blueprint, and beside it, names. 5 of them. Each circled, each connected to the cartel that had shattered his world. Frank didn't believe in chance. He believed in method. The cartel thought they had burned a man's soul and left ash behind. But they forgot who he was. They forgot what he was. Before retirement, before family, he was a man the government sent when problems refused to disappear. And now, those skills, long buried under years of silence and solitude, were coming back with terrifying precision. He started with intel, favors owed, contacts from a past life. One whisper led to another. The man who rigged the explosives was hiding in an abandoned desert compound under the protection of low-level sicarios. The Mustang roared across the cracked highway like a beast awakened, its engine echoing through the canyon like thunder. No GPS, no backup, just grit, steel, and an old soldier who'd had everything taken from him. When Frank reached the compound, night had already swallowed the sky. He scouted the perimeter with night vision goggles, gear that should have been retired along with him, but like Frank, it still had work to do. Inside, cartel members drank, laughed, oblivious to the ghost that was coming for them. They had forgotten the old legends, the kind of men who didn't just fight. They ended things. He moved with surgical coldness. A silent takedown on the perimeter guard, a timed charge on the fuel truck, and then, boom, chaos. The Mustang's headlights pierced the dust like judgment itself as Clint Eastwood, shotgun in hand, stepped through the flames with death in his eyes. One by one, the men ran. One by one, they fell. By sunrise, only smoke and silence remained. Frank stood over the first crossed-out name on his list. He looked down at the man who had started it all, whispered one word, "Judgment," and walked away without looking back. The desert wind howled as Frank Delaney, Clint Eastwood's hardened and scarred alter ego leaned against the hood of his Mustang, the rising sun casting long shadows across his weathered face. He had crossed off the first name on his list, but the trail of vengeance was far from over. The next name led not into the wastelands or criminal dens, but into something more dangerous, his own past. The second man on the list was a familiar ghost. Miguel Cortez, once a trusted informant during Frank's undercover work in Mexico, now turned traitor. Years ago, Frank had pulled him from a cartel prison, saved his life, and given him a second chance. But Miguel had sold out, not just Frank, but his country. And now he sat high on cartel money, running a legitimate auto empire as a front. In the heart of Los Angeles, beneath bright lights and shiny glass towers, Miguel's empire grew fat on blood. Frank knew this wouldn't be a mission won by brute force. The city had eyes, cameras, and politics. He couldn't just walk in guns blazing. Instead, he used the weapon the enemy never expected: his silence. Posing as a high-roller collector, Frank rolled the Mustang into Miguel's exclusive car auction, a gathering of oil barons, criminals in suits, and influencers who thought the world belonged to them. No one recognized the quiet old man with the slow walk and sharp gaze. No one except Miguel. Their eyes locked across the room. For a second, everything froze. Miguel's smug grin vanished. He remembered. He knew. The man he thought had died with his family was alive and had come bearing judgment. But Frank didn't confront him there. He waited, patient as a vulture. That night, as Miguel left in a bulletproof black Escalade flanked by security, Frank followed in the Mustang, headlights off, engine low, like a predator stalking its prey. The ambush came just outside the city, beneath an overpass where streetlights flickered and cameras went blind. With pinpoint precision, Frank laid spike strips, disabling the convoy in seconds. The guards never stood a chance, knocked out and disarmed before they could draw breath. Miguel, trembling in his seat, stepped out slowly, hands raised, sweat dripping down his designer suit. "You sold my family for money," Frank growled, his voice like gravel soaked in rage. Miguel begged, wept, tried to reason. But Frank wasn't there to talk. He was there to remind him that blood can't be washed away with cash. A single shot echoed into the night, not messy, not angry, just final. As Frank disappeared into the dark with the Mustang's taillights fading like fireflies in the wind, another name was crossed off the list, and Los Angeles would never speak of the man who vanished without a trace. But whispered legends grew louder. The list was getting shorter, but the road was getting bloodier. Clint Eastwood's character, Frank Delaney, now deep into his warpath, drove his roaring '70 Mustang into the Sierra foothills, rough country, scarred with old logging roads and abandoned cabins where no law dared reach. The next name on his list, Eladio El Tigre Mendez, wasn't a man who hid in cities. He preferred nature's fortress, rugged terrain, thick woods, and armed sentries. He was the muscle behind the massacre, the one who gave the kill order and made it personal. Frank parked at the base of the trail as the sun dipped behind the hills. The Mustang's engine ticked in the cooling night air. He opened the trunk, revealing weapons wrapped in oilcloth: a scoped rifle, an old Colt revolver, and a hunting knife that had seen too many wars. This wasn't a hit, it was a hunt. Moving like a phantom through the underbrush, Frank climbed the rocky trail, silent and deadly. Every crunch of gravel, every gust of wind through the trees became part of his rhythm. He was in his element again. This was where the old Frank had been forged, before the house, before the quiet dinners, before he had something to lose. Hours passed before he reached the lookout point above Eladio's hideout. There, by the flickering orange light of a campfire, sat a dozen armed guards drinking, laughing, careless. At the center, in a wooden lodge surrounded by trucks and floodlights, was Eladio, large, loud, and drunk on power. Frank studied their patrol pattern. He counted movements, watched for blind spots, calculated the wind. Then, like a switch had flipped, he struck. First, the generator. A single suppressed shot took it out, and darkness swallowed the hill. Panic spread like wildfire. Flashlights swept across the trees. Men shouted in Spanish. Boots crunched across gravel. But they didn't know where the ghost was hiding. Frank picked them off one by one, methodical, cold, like death whispering through the trees. The final confrontation came in the cabin. Eladio, panting, clutching a shotgun, stumbled through the door and found Frank waiting. They stared at each other. Two predators, two relics of a dying world. "You think killing me will bring them back?" Eladio hissed. Frank raised his Colt. "No," he said, "but it'll stop the nightmares." The thunder of the shot echoed down the mountain, and silence fell once more. By morning, smoke curled above the treetops. Locals would talk about the gunfire. Authorities would find nothing but burned vehicles, empty cabins, and shell casings. But the legend would grow. An old man in a Mustang, bringing hell with him wherever he rode. The road was nearly over. Only one name remained. Frank Delaney, Clint Eastwood's silent avenger, had scorched a path of justice from the city lights of L.A. to the cold silence of the Sierra Hills. But the final stop wasn't in the shadows. It was in broad daylight, beneath a polished marble sign that read, Cortez International Holdings, perched atop a glass tower in San Diego. The man behind it all, Rafael Cortez, wasn't a soldier or a street thug. He wore silk suits, hosted charity galas, and shook hands with senators. But Frank knew the truth. Rafael had ordered the hit, funded the cartel, and treated the massacre of Frank's family as a line item in a corporate budget. It wasn't just revenge now. It was justice against a system that believed power could hide behind glass and gold. Frank checked into a room across from the tower. He watched through binoculars for hours, timing Raphael's routine down to the minute. The man drank a Cuban coffee at 9:15. He walked to the executive elevator alone at 11. And every afternoon at 3:30, he stepped out onto the rooftop terrace, smug and untouchable. That was when Frank struck. Disguised as a janitor, he entered through the underground parking lot, taking out security silently, slipping past surveillance like a ghost in plain sight. He climbed 34 floors, not because he had to, but because it made him feel alive again. Every step was a memory. Every breath was for the people he lost. When the rooftop doors swung open, Raphael turned slowly. His smirk faltered. "You look like hell," he said. Frank walked toward him, revolver at his side. "You made me this way." They didn't fight. There were no words left. Just the click of the hammer, the sharp crack of justice echoing into the sky, and Rafael Cortez falling like every man who thought he was untouchable. As police sirens howled and helicopters circled, Frank didn't run. He stood at the edge of the rooftop, wind whipping his coat, face calm. He holstered his revolver and raised his hands. They could arrest the man, but the legend, the old cowboy who rode a Mustang and avenged his family, that would ride on. Months later, stories spread across the country. No charges stuck. No witnesses spoke. Some said he vanished again, like smoke in the wind. Others said they saw the Mustang parked near dusty towns, always near trouble, always leaving justice in its rearview mirror. Because revenge may ride a Mustang, but justice always rides with Clint Eastwood.